Let's face it, production is often a thankless job. Producers offer hard choices, tough news, scope and deadline revisions. Those conversations and more can be difficult and emotional for everyone involved. Our next speaker believes that one trait in particular is critical to helping a team find success and well being over the course of development: vulnerability. Bringing her experience from her time at Phenomena and TVO Kids, as well as her current role as production manager for Sago Mini, please welcome Andrea Luc.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea, and today I'm here to talk about vulnerability in game production. So thank you so much for joining in. Before I begin, I just thought I'd give just a bit of context around who I am and why I'm specifically speaking about this topic. I am based in Toronto currently, but I actually grew up in small town Ontario, and as a result, a lot of my childhood was a bit boring since there just wasn't much to do aside from make music or play video games for me. And that was really a large way for me to connect with other folks in the community and also with my own family members. So I think a lot of that has really shaped who I am and how I've ended up here today with you all. So yeah, growing up, obviously media and tech were just how I connected with others. And along the way, I just started becoming really interested in how they were able to shape these interactions between human beings. Games specifically, I thought were really fascinating since they were so immersive and interactive, and there's so much story there that I remember my sister and I would just kind of talk about with any game that we were playing. So I really wanted to be a game developer growing up. And so today I'm currently a production manager at Sago Mini. I work on Sago Mini World, and I've generally been in production for about 5 years now. Prior to this, I was at a studio named Phenomena and also a Canadian nonprofit, also as a producer. And I also earned my MA just studying the relationship between young girls and their access to video games and gaming culture as a whole. And I think all of this lived and learned experience has again just brought me to where I am today. And while I have loved parts of my job and have made invaluable friendships through this industry, there's still such a large part of me that wonders if I'm actually meant to be here. So if you don't mind, today I'd like to be a bit vulnerable with you. Just to know that I think being vulnerable with each other requires a certain amount of unlearning certain frameworks that we've grown accustomed to and have grown up with. And all of that is really impacted by our own identities. So for me specifically, I've grown up as a first generation Asian Canadian cis woman. So what I'm exploring today is just interpreted through that identity. And as a result, I really encourage you to chime in with your own thoughts through the chat as well, since again, this is just through one perspective. So before I begin as well, I just want to give a quick overview around what a producer does, since I'll be talking more in depth about production and practices around vulnerability. And I don't know, as a producer, you just kind of do a bunch of things and wear a bunch of different hats. So generally, you figure out how to make a game based on everyone's skills and needs. You really oversee the daily development. You're constantly helping unblock folks, and you're keeping track of those larger milestones and setting those timelines too. But another large part of this job, I think, is really caring for team health and morale, and related to that, trying to foster a culture that embraces openness, honesty, and of course, vulnerability, since I think those are all things that are vitally important to any team. So as I mentioned, I have been grappling, I think, with what my future looks like here. And lately I've been asking myself if it is possible for me to have a long-term sustainable career working in games. And a large part of that question just comes from my own lived and embodied experience in this space. Part of that is impacted just by the industry and what the current demographic is in the industry. And so game development has just historically been made more accessible to cis men, specifically men who fit into a certain ideal. And so Westar and Legault, who help run the IGDA Developer Satisfaction Survey, and also publish research around what the DSS can tell us about the industry's makeup, they actually offer insight into how precisely this has taken shape. And in one of their articles, they actually write that the game dev career pipeline makes a lot of quote unquote masculine assumptions about certain cognitive styles, professionalism, all things that have kind of contributed to this leaky pipeline, career pipeline for women and marginalized folks trickling out of the industry entirely, leaving the industry entirely. And further, who has access to the industry in terms of knowledge, network, and socioeconomic status is still very favorable towards men. And I think that is seen in the 2021 stats here in this slide. So 62% of respondents reported as men, 30% reported as women, and only 8% reported as non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, or two-spirited. And when that's cross-referenced with data that they collected around sexual orientation as well, overwhelmingly 68% of respondents were also heterosexual, which I think paints a very clear picture of who is the primary identity within game development. Further, the ethnic composition of the industry is still predominantly white or only white. So 78% of respondents were reported in as white, 68% reported as only white, 10% reported in as Hispanic, 5% reported as Black, and 4% of folks only reported in as other Chinese or Indigenous. And so I really do believe that our identities inevitably shape our experiences working in games. And when I think about these statistics and this body of research around, what masculine assumptions are and how that's internalized within our own work and our work cultures, I start to see the ways in which it's crept into my own behavior. I think we see this in our own lived experience working in games. We learn to kind of keep an air of, professional cool and emotional distance. You might learn to lessen the amount of exclamation marks you use in email and Slack, and just generally not talk about anything that really makes you uncomfortable that you might experience. We learn to hide parts of ourselves in the systems that gave us our jobs to begin with because we've made it and we don't want to lose it or, rock the boat. But a lot of this forces us to neglect our own lived truths. And I think it contributes to a larger cultural problem that the games industry has clearly grappled with for decades, excluding those and parts of ourselves who don't fit into the mold of who we think of when we hear game developer. It feels like a disservice to our craft and to ourselves to uphold these values, to really shut down how we feel. When I think about the times that I have been happiest in this line of work, it's when I've gotten to connect with others making something. Games are an art form, and making them is a chance for people with varying backgrounds and experiences and identities to come together and create a shared reality. And instead of hiding ourselves that don't fit into this very specific mold of who is a game developer, I think we should embrace them and connect with others who are looking for a similar sense of belonging. I think every one of us has a story to tell, and it just so happens that our jobs are making stories and worlds. And when we can be honest with who we are, we can start to see how they shape the things that we create. We can start to create with care and encourage all of us to be vulnerable and to find that belonging. The process of being honest with ourselves and how it shapes our work for me starts with vulnerability. So broadly, vulnerability as defined by this feminist scholar, Erin Gilson, is an openness, and more specifically, to be vulnerable is to be open to being affected and affecting in ways that one cannot control. Erin Gilson writes that vulnerability is pervasive, fundamental, shared, and something we cannot ever entirely avoid. It's both extraordinary and mundane, conducive to both empathy and outrage, a product of injustice, and a virtue one develops to contest injustice. And I love this quote because, I mean, simply put, vulnerability comes from a place of feeling within and also past ourselves. It's a rejection to keep our feelings bottled up. And it comes from that yearning to connect with others and know that we aren't alone. And in an industry that has actively discouraged marginalized folks from being open about how we feel, and that's really only encouraged us to value, these masculine assumptions, as Westar and Legault wrote about, I think vulnerability is ultimately also a form of resistance. It's also super important for us to acknowledge and understand that vulnerability can't be divorced from who we are. Our identities affect our relationship with how open we're comfortable being, and also our ability to be uncomfortable. And so for me specifically, as an Asian Canadian woman, I found a lot of solace in what Cathy Park Hong wrote in her book, Minor Feelings. But I think it can also resonate a bit more broadly. So I'll just read this quote here. Cathy Park Hong writes that for Asians, Western culture insists that our racial identity is beside the point, that it has nothing to do with being bullied or passed over for a promotion or cut off every time we talk. It's like being ghosted, where deprived of all social cues, I have no relational gauge for my behavior. This especially resonated with me since I think to survive in workplaces generally, I've learned to be quiet, to almost disappear in many social and professional settings. And to talk about my feelings in any capacity means putting myself in a position where I'm now an active contributor. And that creates a space for others to join in that conversation, which I think can be a bit scary. It's also just so isolating, among other things, to not feel like you're being heard and to not have that relational gauge to others who can't understand that frustration of not being able to be open. And so in this sense, openness and vulnerability have been invaluable to my own personal and professional growth. It's helped me develop that gauge with others who do understand, and has helped me feel a little less alone the more that I do share. So it's kind of helped me find that connection and belonging that I haven't grown up really knowing. Okay, so that was a lot. And why does this specifically matter for game development? I think that if we want to start mending this leaky pipeline, this leaky career pipeline for marginalized folks in the industry, we have to start acknowledging the impact that vulnerability can have in creating sustainable processes. So being vulnerable with each other is, I think, crucial to game development. It helps us validate what we're feeling and build meaningful connections with each other, while kind of forming a baseline foundation of care. It can also generate thoughtful discussion around game content, whether or not what we're creating resonates with us as players, and also helps surfaces some assumptions that we might have about our audience as well. And I think it can open up communication about how we work together and challenge why things are the way they are. All of these things are tied to each other. We create games that we're proud of when we work with healthy teams that are comfortable sharing their diverse perspectives. And we can only have those perspectives if we actively work to create inclusive and sustainable workplaces. I think vulnerability is a way to work through all of these things simultaneously. All of this is vitally important for any individual and also for any team to talk about. And in my role specifically as a producer slash production manager currently, I really do think it's our job to make sure our teams are healthy and that our games reflect that. Our process of working through all phases of production have to allow for people to be people, and for everyone to live their lives as truly as they can. And that the process of how we make these games should be shaped by our team's values and not the other way around. For game development to be a sustainable career for marginalized folks, we have to make space for each other and find ways in our work to showcase who we are and what we want our output, our shared reality, to be. So as we continue to think about creating games that resonate internally and with wider audiences and focus on sustainability in our production processes and overall careers, we have to actively work within ourselves and with each other on what vulnerability looks like for our teams. Sometimes it's about giving ourselves permission and the space to be vulnerable. And I think that's how I've tried to approach this in production. So here are a few ways that vulnerability has impacted the game production processes that I've been a part of. So I think it's inevitable that we'll make our own assumptions around the world around us. And for me, I often find myself following them rather than challenging them. Our assumptions about the people we interact with, the knowledge we each hold, are all based on our past experiences and belief systems. And so before we start any project, meeting, or conversation, I like to ask myself a few questions to just make sure I'm recognizing the assumptions that I'm holding, and to kind of actively work to challenge that. I ask myself how I'm feeling when I'm entering any communicative space, whether that's just a message online or a meeting that I'll have to facilitate. And I try to walk myself through what knowledge is known and unknown between everyone who's in the room or in the conversation. If there's anything unknown, I ask myself how I can approach that with the team. And I also ask myself if everyone has access to that same knowledge, and if not, what we can do to help that or unblock that. I also ask myself how our past experiences shape a lot of our current interactions and processes, and how every single one of us might be bringing that into the overall production pipeline. And so doing this has really helped set the tone for myself first before I'm able to set it for the rest of the project. Obviously, I think fostering a space for folks to be open and honest requires making it as comfortable as possible to talk about the hard stuff. And so I think as a producer, this is really an ongoing task. And so creating a space to talk about the hard stuff is just so incredibly important to having folks open up and feel comfortable being honest. And I think creating space to be vulnerable happens in a few ways, but for me, it really starts with vocalizing and reinforcing to the team that it is okay to be honest about how you're feeling as we work together. And so I try to say this at the start of any project and also throughout our recurring touch points as well, because I think by vocalizing this aloud, it gives all of us permission to be upfront. And so while it will take time for folks to open up, I think just simply saying this is a really good first step to just creating that space. And a lot of this conversation will arise when there's a strong level of trust within your team. And I think as a producer, a good portion of your job is to simply show up for your team. It's to be open with them, to champion them, and to help them realize their goals in small and big ways throughout development. And so for me, I like to make the most out of the recurring touch points that I've listed on the slides, sprint planning meetings, retros, any Slack check-ins, and also one-on-ones, which I'm a super big fan of. For one-on-one specifically, I use this time to learn more about each person, and I structure each of my one-on-ones to in a way that fits whatever that individual's specific goals are, and whatever conversation will help them realize those goals or help them work on those goals in order to encourage a level of openness and vulnerability between us. And in these one-on-ones as well, I will also be as vulnerable as I'm comfortable with. And so as an example of this, for one colleague, I eventually learned through our one-on-ones that for them, they were feeling quite vulnerable about their level of confidence, and that they wanted to work on things like negative self-talk as it related to their own personal and professional growth. So after learning that, I wanted to just give them space to focus on some of their achievements, big and small. So I took one of our one-on-ones and I created a Miro board for us to do just a very super casual brainstorm / mind map on things that we both accomplished over the last week. I made sure to make it private so that it was just the two of us who could access it. And then I saved the screenshot and then deleted the board afterwards just to keep that within our circle. And I just wanted them to be able to view the things that I was writing for my own section as well. So as you can see here, I started writing down super minor things and some larger things. And I did that because I wanted to normalize that accomplishments don't have to be this grand thing. We can recognize the small changes that we make in our lives to improve and feel that sense of accomplishment, which was something that kind of came up in a lot of our conversation. And so I just kind of broke out a few days of the week, and then I wrote down things like, I helped a friend out with croissants, which at the time, I'm just making space for that was for me an accomplishment. And then I also wrote some larger things, like I showed some vulnerability with some folks, which I think was something to celebrate as well. And I made some backup plans for something I was nervous about, and I also took some rest that week. So I just wanted to kind of show them where I was coming from to hopefully help them normalize, that again, accomplishments don't have to be this big grand thing. And so, yeah, this was just one exercise that I did. There's no way of measuring how much something like this helps someone. But for me, again, it's just about creating that space to surface these thoughts and concerns. And it's really just about helping them figure out small, like incremental things that they can also start doing to work on their own personal and professional growth, which I think is invaluable for the team and also for all of us. So the next thing that I've tried to do to foster a sense of openness and vulnerability within our team is simply just following my team's vibe. And so vulnerability is obviously something that happens organically. There's no one way to encourage folks to feel comfortable being vulnerable. And so while I try my best to make space for it, it's ultimately best to follow the team's lead and see what they're actually comfortable with. So I worked on a variety of teams where the nature of things has been, friendly, but just more focused on the project. And I've also been on teams that I've wanted to make it a priority to focus on our own connections with each other first. So I do my best to be flexible with how I approach certain topics. And I don't push further if I do sense some hesitancy. I just make sure to communicate that if folks want to talk or open up beyond themselves, that I'm here to listen. So again, fostering a sense of vulnerability sometimes requires patience for folks to give themselves the permission and space to open up. In those specific moments, conversation might be quiet, and it might be quiet for a little bit. And I just think it's really okay to sit in silence sometimes, because I think the more comfortable we are with being in silence together, the more intentional each conversation gets, and it just makes it a bit easier to open up in that way. So as an example of following my team's vibe, recently on a project, I was really fortunate to work with a team that was just very naturally open with how they felt, and they were very expressive. And so a few of them mentioned to me that they were keen on focusing on fostering a team culture where we could all grow together. So as a result, I put together what I call a production tarot. which was basically just a set of prompts related to certain themes. So at the start of each sprint session, I asked the team if they felt like choosing a card that day. And if they did, they would collectively choose one, and then we would discuss the prompt that was on that card. So the themes that I chose were collaboration, discovery, growth, accomplishment, letting go, and inspiration. And the prompts that I had as well were all, again, related to those themes. So here's just a few examples around certain prompts that I felt really resonated with my team. Some prompts that I had didn't, and I think that is okay as well. I think since the themes are so broad, it's best to kind of like tailor the questions specifically to your team's need. And so some of the examples that I have here that we had for discussion were, if you could send a message to yourself at the start of this project, what would you say? Did you make a mistake last week? That's okay. What did you learn? And did you discover something new last week? What was it? It could be anything, like a new coffee shop, Unity tool, a cool word, etc. And so I just kept these prompts, again, very general, and I just related it to each specific theme. And I didn't reveal the themes to the team at all. I wanted them to just kind of view the graphic on the card and just like go with their guts. So yeah, ultimately, I think this was a super helpful tool for all of us to connect with each other and just do a bit of that team building at the start of each meeting. And again, there were some prompts that weren't so provocative, but I think the themes are flexible enough to just keep thinking out more questions and tailoring them to the team's needs. So yeah, this was just one tool I used to kind of help foster a bit of that openness. I think also encouraging vulnerability within our work and with each other is just sharing your own failures and owning your mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, and I think we all do. And I think addressing your own mistakes directly and in a timely way not only strengthens the trust on your team, but it also makes it okay for others to do the same. I think it's a sign of healthy vulnerability. You're opening up about something that impacted someone individually or the project as a whole, and you're working with yourself and with your team to move forward together. Often when I make a mistake, I try and catch it and speak to it directly. I outline what I did, what the mistake was, and the impact that it might have had on others or the project. And I also outline just how I plan to move forward from that mistake and things that I did learn from that. And doing this, I think, comes from a place of wanting to be held accountable to myself and to the team. Because I think ultimately accountability and trust are two things that we all need to grow in any healthy capacity. And I also think that when you own your mistakes and you are open about them, it makes it okay for others to do that as well. So recently, as an example of this, I managed a project where I overscoped the art workload. And midway through the project, I received some feedback from the team. They were feeling a bit overwhelmed with the amount of work left to do. So when I heard this, I acknowledged my own shortcomings in how we got to this point to begin with in production. And then I started to shift the focus on what we could start doing to lessen their workload and to make them feel a bit more at ease. So together we started making cuts to the scope, and I started to shift some timelines around in our schedule. And in the end, we were able to meet our deadlines, but I think more importantly, we flagged ways to ensure that scope was now at the forefront of every design conversation moving forward. And I was just so incredibly grateful to my team members for feeling comfortable enough to voice their frustrations and concerns with me. And some of them later shared that they were only so honest about their feelings with me when they wouldn't have otherwise been, because they trusted that I would do something. So I'm just really thankful for these relationships and for that level of vulnerability that we were able to cultivate just by owning up to our mistakes. So for me, being open about my failures has helped shift the focus away from dwelling what I can't change in the past to how I can move forward. And lastly, I think this one is super important for anyone. I think especially if you are a producer or a team lead. You are so often your team's sounding board. And I think it's important that you also find folks who can be your sounding board. The job of producers specifically can sometimes feel really emotionally heavy. And I think you need someone to be there for you too. Someone for you to be unapologetically vulnerable with without feeling like, it's a burden, because it's not. It's easy to take on a large mental and emotional workload in this specific role, and it can at times feel isolating. So while you're often the person being there for others and creating a space that encourages everyone to share their thoughts and feelings, for me, I've been in workplaces where I felt like I didn't have a separate outlet to do those things outside of the team. So for your own well-being, I think it's vitally important for producers to find your own sounding board too. Someone you can run ideas past, vent to, someone to give you feedback when you need it and help offer just that outside perspective. Okay. So learnings and takeaways. So I think ultimately, being vulnerable in game production allows us all to do our best work together in a way that feels sustainable and healthy. Teams are encouraged to find joy throughout production and also make joy when we're honest about how we feel. Small and really meaningful relationships and even communities can form within work environments when we share our vulnerable selves. And I think it creates less of a barrier around collaboration and communication. And also when it comes to production processes and the ways in which we work together, I think being vulnerable also makes it a bit easier for team members to raise concerns and blockers in a really constructive way, in a way that frames it around how we can just move forward and start to find some solutions. And so I think giving ourselves space to be vulnerable is hugely beneficial to the things we make and how we make them, and who we're making them with. All of this matters if we want to work towards creating a sustainable career pipeline for marginalized folks in the industry. I think in order to change the prototype of who we think of when we hear game developer, we have to actively make space for new and current perspectives that fit outside of that mold. We have to acknowledge the ways our identities have been held up to an expectation that we simply can't access, and work within and outside of ourselves to challenge them. We have to create a culture of vulnerability and care to shed light on the systemic and systematic ways we've been told that we don't fit in. And I think ultimately all of this matters if we want to find belonging in this industry and make this a inclusive and sustainable place for marginalized folks to work in. And so, yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I'll be in the chat if you have any more questions or thoughts.
It really stuck out to me when Andrea said, vulnerability comes from a place of feeling within and also past ourselves. It's a rejection to keep our feelings bottled up, and it comes from a yearning to connect with others and know that we aren't alone. I think the impact of vulnerability has definitely shown itself over the past half hour. Thank you so much for your talk and your experiences, Andrea.